Back in the late 1990s, there was a moment when it looked like the biggest wrestling company in the world was about to die. And the company killing it was not some small startup. It was WCW, a company that went from being a struggling regional wrestling promotion to beating the mighty WWF in the ratings for 83 straight weeks, something nobody thought was possible. And then somehow, almost unbelievably, WCW collapsed so badly that it was sold for a shockingly low price to the very rival it once crushed. And if you were watching wrestling during that era, you probably still wonder the same thing today. How did a company with Hulk Hogan, Sting, Goldberg, Ric Flair, the NWO, and millions of fans lose everything so fast? Because what happened behind the scenes was even crazier than what fans saw on television. To understand WCW, you have to go way back before Monday Nitro, before the NWO, and even before Hulk Hogan walked into the company. Because WCW actually started as part of the old National Wrestling Alliance, or the NWA, which was basically a collection of wrestling territories spread across America. And one of the strongest territories was Jim Crockett Promotions, based in the southern United States, especially around the Carolinas and Georgia. Back then, wrestling felt different. It felt gritty and serious. Fans believed in it more. And stars like Ric Flair became legends because of their charisma and incredible matches. Jim Crockett Promotions was making good money. But there was a huge problem. World Wrestling Federation under Vince McMahon was expanding aggressively across the country. Vince was turning wrestling into a national entertainment machine. Colorful characters, huge arenas, toys, merchandise, and massive television deals. Jim Crockett tried to compete, but the company expanded too fast and spent too much money. By the late 1980s, they were in serious trouble. And that is when media giant Turner Broadcasting stepped in and bought the company, renaming it World Championship Wrestling, or WCW. At first, this seemed like a dream scenario. Ted Turner loved wrestling. He reportedly told people that if Vince McMahon was in the wrestling business, then he wanted to be in it too. And unlike smaller promoters, Turner had money, television networks, and national reach. WCW suddenly had resources that most wrestling companies could only dream about. But things didn't stay that way. Because even with all that money, WCW struggled badly in the early years. Management changed constantly. Creative ideas were all over the place, and the company felt directionless. Meanwhile, WWF was dominating pop culture with stars like Hulk Hogan, The Ultimate Warrior, and Bret Hart. WCW had talent. Tons of talent, actually, but the company could never fully organize itself. One executive would push one idea, another would kill it, and wrestlers often had too much power backstage. There were moments where WCW looked promising, especially with wrestlers like Sting and Ric Flair carrying the company, but it always felt like they were one step behind WWF. Then came the early 1990s, and this is where everything changed. WWF hit a rough patch due to steroid controversies and declining popularity. Suddenly, Vince McMahon looked vulnerable for the first time in years, and WCW sensed an opportunity. They started signing former WWF stars, and the biggest signing of all was Hulk Hogan in 1994. Now honestly, when Hogan first arrived, some fans were excited, but others thought it was a mistake, because WCW already had younger talents who needed the spotlight. But Hogan was still a giant star, maybe the biggest wrestling name on earth at that point, and Turner executives believed he could take WCW mainstream. At first, Hogan did exactly that. Pay-per-view numbers improved, media attention increased, and WCW suddenly felt bigger. But there was still a problem. The shows often felt old-fashioned. Too many gimmicks, too many recycled WWF ideas, and younger fans were looking for something edgier. Then came Monday Nitro in 1995. Nitro changed wrestling forever. UCW decided to go head-to-head with WWF on Monday nights, directly competing against Monday Night Raw. And for the first time ever, wrestling fans had a real war to watch every single week. And WCW came out swinging. The production looked slick, the arenas felt bigger, and the atmosphere felt unpredictable. Unlike WWF, which was still taped at times, Nitro was live, and that made everything feel dangerous and exciting. Then WCW pulled one of the smartest moves in wrestling history. They signed Scott Hall and Kevin Nash away from WWF, but instead of simply introducing them as new wrestlers, WCW created an invasion storyline where Hall and Nash appeared as outsiders trying to take over the company. Fans went crazy because many genuinely thought WWF was invading WCW, and then came Bash at the Beach 1996. This moment changed wrestling history forever. Hall and Nash promised a third man would join them. Fans speculated for weeks. Some thought it would be Sting, others thought maybe Bret Hart. But what happened next was shocking. Hulk Hogan walked out and turned heel. For years, Hogan had been the ultimate good guy, the superhero of wrestling. Kids loved him, parents loved him, and suddenly he was attacking WCW stars and forming the New World Order, the NWO. The crowd threw trash into the ring. People were screaming. It felt real. And WCW became the hottest thing in entertainment, almost overnight. The NWO storyline was cool, rebellious, edgy, and unpredictable. It perfectly matched the late 1990s attitude. Suddenly, Nitro was beating Raw every week, and not just barely beating it, crushing it. For 83 weeks straight, WCW won the ratings war. Think about how insane that is. WWF looked dead in the water. WCW had the biggest stars, the hottest angle, and massive momentum. And during this period, they created unforgettable moments. Sting transforming into a silent vigilante character inspired by The Crow. Goldberg destroying opponents in seconds while building an undefeated streak. Ric Flair delivering emotional promos, and the NWO constantly causing chaos. At its peak, WCW felt unstoppable. The company was making huge money, arenas were packed, merchandise was flying off shelves, and wrestling itself became mainstream again. But underneath all that success, serious cracks were forming. One of the biggest problems was backstage politics. Top stars had enormous creative control in their contracts, especially Hulk Hogan and Kevin Nash, which meant they could refuse storylines, change finishes, and protect themselves from losing. That sounds small, but it became a disaster. Younger wrestlers struggled to rise because older stars constantly stayed in the spotlight. Talents like Chris Jericho, Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio, and Chris Benoit were delivering incredible performances, but WCW often treated them like secondary attractions. And meanwhile, WWF was quietly rebuilding itself. This is where the story gets fascinating. While WCW leaned heavily on older stars and endless NWO storylines, WWF reinvented itself completely with the Attitude Era. Suddenly stars like Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock exploded in popularity. Their promos felt raw and authentic. The product felt faster and more exciting. And WCW did not adapt quickly enough. Then came one of the most infamous moments in wrestling history. During an episode of Nitro, announcer Tony Schiavone sarcastically spoiled that Mick Foley was going to win the WWF Championship on Raw, expecting fans to change channels away from WWF. Instead, hundreds of thousands of viewers switched to Raw to see it happen. That single moment became symbolic of WCW's arrogance. And from there, things got worse fast. Storylines became confusing and ridiculous. Celebrities appeared randomly. Championships changed hands constantly. And the company started burning money at an unbelievable rate. One week the NWO was black and white, the next it was Wolfpack. Then different versions split apart and reformed again. Fans started getting tired of it. And maybe the biggest missed opportunity of all was Sting versus Hogan at Starrcade 1997. Fans waited over a year for Sting to finally defeat Hogan cleanly. It should have been a legendary ending, but the match ended in confusion. because of backstage politics and questionable decisions. Many fans believe that moment damaged WCW permanently because it showed something important. WCW no longer trusted its own storytelling. Then came 1999, and honestly this period feels almost unbelievable when you look back at it. Executives panicked, creative teams changed constantly, writers were replaced again and again. At one point, WCW hired Vince Russo from WWF, hoping he could recreate the Attitude Era magic. But instead, the product became even more chaotic. There were bizarre storylines, shocking swerves that made no sense, and moments that fans still laugh at today. David Arquette winning the WCW World Championship became one of the most controversial decisions ever, and even Arquette himself later admitted he hated the idea. Meanwhile, WWF kept getting hotter. Stone Cold was everywhere. The Rock became a megastar, and WCW felt lost. Then there was Goldberg. Goldberg was one of the last truly massive WCW creations. Fans loved his intensity and undefeated streak. He felt special, almost superhero-like. But WCW eventually ruined that momentum too, with questionable booking decisions. And once fans stop trusting a wrestling company, it becomes very hard to win them back. What happened next was shocking. In 2000, WCW was bleeding money badly, ratings collapsed, live attendance dropped, and Turner executives who once supported wrestling were losing interest, especially after corporate mergers changed the leadership structure. Ted Turner himself no longer had the same power inside the company. And without Turner protecting WCW, the company suddenly looked expendable. There were attempts to save it. Some executives wanted to reboot the product completely. Others tried focusing on younger talent, and for brief moments it seemed like maybe WCW could recover. But the damage was too deep. In March 2001, WCW aired its final episode of Nitro. And in one of the strangest moments in entertainment history, the company was purchased by Vince McMahon. Yes, the same rival, WCW, once humiliated for 83 weeks, had now bought the entire company. For many fans, it felt unreal. The Monday Night War was over, and WWF had won. The final Nitro episode even featured Vince McMahon appearing on screen while Raw aired simultaneously, symbolizing the complete end of WCW. And honestly, it was emotional, because despite all its flaws, WCW mattered. It gave wrestling fans competition. It forced WWF to improve. It created unforgettable stars and moments. Without WCW, wrestling might never have reached those incredible heights in the late 1990s. But here's the interesting part. Years later, many wrestlers and fans started looking back at WCW with a strange mix of frustration and nostalgia. Because WCW was not just a failure story, it was also a story of massive creativity and ambition. When WCW was good, it was unbelievable. The cruiserweight division changed wrestling forever, bringing faster international styles into mainstream American wrestling. Wrestlers from Mexico and Japan suddenly had a bigger spotlight, and many modern wrestling styles today owe a huge debt to WCW. Even the mistakes became legendary. People still talk about the finger poke of doom, the endless NWO variations, and the backstage politics because the rise and fall was so dramatic. And maybe that is why fans still love discussing WCW today. It felt unpredictable, chaotic, messy, sometimes brilliant, sometimes ridiculous, but never boring today. WCW no longer exists as an active company. Its video library and intellectual property are owned by WWE, and younger wrestling fans mostly know WCW through documentaries, old matches, and stories from wrestlers who lived through that era. But its influence is still everywhere. Modern wrestling promotions understand the importance of competition. Because of WCW, the idea of edgy factions, reality-based storytelling, and live unpredictable television became huge, partly because of WCW's success. And in a weird way, WCW's downfall became one of the biggest lessons in entertainment history. Because having talent and money is not enough. You also need vision, discipline, and the ability to evolve before the audience moves on. WCW had all the advantages in the world at one point. Money, stars, ratings, momentum. And somehow it still slipped away. Maybe that is what makes the story so fascinating. It was not a tiny company crushed by a giant. For a brief moment, WCW actually became the giant. And then it collapsed under its own weight. So now the question goes to you. If WCW had handled things differently, could they have defeated WWF permanently? Or was the collapse inevitable from the very beginning? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.